Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Ali Wyne, who is a senior analyst in the global macro geopolitics practice at Eurasia Group. Ali, nice to see you.
Thank you very much for having me, Diane. Pleasure to be with you.
We are talking about BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the expansion, bringing in 6 other countries. I want to talk about the significance of that, but let's first talk about the significance of BRICS a bit, because it was an investment thesis that kind of became a loose organization. How powerful is it today?
So I think that it's powerful in a number of ways. It's powerful, first of all, symbolically. Remember, there were a lot of doubts, and there remain a lot of doubts about the BRICS. It's this kind of scattershot collection of countries that seem kind of disparate, and they have certain shared grievances, but do they have shared purposes? And so there was a lot of interest in the run up to this particular summit. But keep in mind, a lot of folks in advance of this summit, they thought that the summit would produce maybe some vague expression of principles about, in theory, admitting new members. There weren't many folks who were speculating or predicting that it would actually admit new members. And it not only admitted new members, it admitted 6 new members. Now, it's true, and I certainly agree with this. I wouldn't call it a critique, but I agree with this point that the original BRICS and the BRICS Plus, it's not a geopolitically coherent grouping. You have rivalries between India and China. You have rivalries between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So it's not a coherent grouping, and yet I think that if you just look at this grouping through the lens of how coherent it is, I think you miss the symbolism of expansion. For me, a big takeaway is that even though many countries that have deep tensions with one another, the fact that they are willing to join this organization, it's kind of emblematic of the zeitgeist of the times, or at least one of the zeitgeists of the time, which is more middle powers, more developing countries saying, look, we want to exercise greater agency in global politics. We want to enhance our foreign policy freedom of maneuver in global politics. And so for me, a big takeaway is, no, it's not a geopolitically coherent group. But the fact that it expanded, contrary to a lot of predictions, is significant. It brings together some interesting bedfellows, but it really is emblematic of the times that people want more alternative institutions. They want greater sway. They want greater choices. So so I think that those two messages are both true at the same time.
You mentioned earlier on shared grievances, and a lot of people are casting this as a reshuffling of the world order. That shared grievance being against the U.S., against the U.S. dollar, Europe. Is that a fair way to interpret this from where you sit?
I would say it's not even necessarily shared grievances against the United States alone, or shared grievances against the West, but well, you could say sort of shared grievances against a certain configuration of power. I think that a lot of countries who have joined, a lot of countries who belong to the original BRICS, kind of the founding 5, as it were, and the countries that are now these plus countries, the 6 plus countries that are going to become full members as of the beginning of next year. Many of them, I should say, they don't want to dispense with their relationships with the West. Many of them have strong relationships with the United States. Many of them have strong relationships with countries in Europe. But they're saying, look, just because we are strengthening our relationships with the West doesn't mean that we don't want to also strengthen our relationships elsewhere. Just because we want to experiment more with trading in our local currencies doesn't mean that we're going to talk about a common currency. But I think that I would say the general sentiment that brings together all of these countries, even those that have very strong relationships in the West, is a greater desire for foreign policy autonomy, a greater desire for a more multipolar international system. And so just to close, I would say the desire for a more multipolar international system, the desire for an international financial system that doesn't depend as heavily on the dollar, doesn't necessarily mean you're anti-US or anti-West. And here I would distinguish between, I think that China, Russia, and now Iran, which will be joining as a full member as of the beginning of next year, those 3 countries, I think, would like to see the BRICS become a more explicitly anti-US or anti-West countervailing bloc. The remaining countries in the grouping, I think that they look at the BRICS as a way to maximize or enhance their freedom of maneuver, but they're not looking to make this into an explicitly anti-West.
New alliance. We should mention who those, you mentioned, of course, Iran. There's also Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Egypt, UAE, and Argentina. I want to look at it let's start with Vladimir Putin, who has been, at the very least, ostracized, other international groups, he's facing sanctions, etc. Is this something that gives him some relief? Is it something that should trouble us as we're trying to, contain Russia's power, at least with regards to Ukraine?
If I were President Putin, I would be pleased with the outcome of this summit, because remember, the narrative has been, I think that the narrative that I think that many folks in the West would like to believe is that Putin has become, by virtue of Russian aggression against Ukraine, that Putin has become a pariah globally, that it's kind of most of the rest of the world on one side versus, Russia. And I think that one of Russia's big objectives coming into this summit was to demonstrate that we're not isolated, that we're not isolated, we're cultivating new relationships, we're participating in an organization, namely the BRICS, that's gaining more and more attention. And so I think that by that metric, he has succeeded. Now, I think it's important that Putin himself was not present in person. The foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, he was present in person. President Putin participated virtually. But I think it's a demonstration that, yes, Russia, by virtue of its aggression against Ukraine, it has brought upon itself unprecedented Western sanctions. And I think that those sanctions over the medium to long term are going to begin to cut in to Russia's ability to grow its economy, to develop or reconstitute its defense industrial base. But I think that Putin's takeaway from the summit will be, you might want to cast us as a pariah, but look, the BRICS now, they're 6 countries larger, or as they will be as of the beginning of next year, and so we're not the pariah that you might want us to be.
What about for Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader who has been exerting a lot more effort to have influence in the region, in Africa, frankly, worldwide? How important is the expansion of BRICS to China?
I think that China is the biggest winner. Keep in mind that of the countries that had been advocating for expanding the BRICS, so a couple of points. One, in 2001, when Jim O'Neill coined the term, so it began, we now have BRICS. It
was the Goldman Sachs investment thesis, basically.
It was a Goldman Sachs investment thesis. So in 2001, when Jim O'Neill coined the term, it was BRIC. It was China that advocated for South Africa's inclusion. So South Africa joins in 2010, so BRIC becomes the BRICS. So China not only advocated for the inclusion of South Africa in the original configuration, but in the run-up to this summit, China had been the most vigorous proponent of further expansion and rapid expansion. And so I think it's a significant diplomatic victory for China. And I think that China as well is trying to demonstrate that it's not, that despite growing pressure from advanced industrial democracies, I think that China is trying to say, we're not going to be isolated. We can exercise influence in alternative fora. And I think that the expansion of the BRICS into a BRICS plus grouping, I think is a significant diplomatic victory for Xi Jinping. And I think the timing is also important. The expansion of the BRICS comes at a time when Xi Jinping is dealing with some very serious economic headwinds at home. There's kind of this, you could say, kind of a coalescing consensus, whether or not you agree with it, but certainly a coalescing consensus among very distinguished economists and other observers saying, has China's 40-year economic boom come to an end? Is demographic decline really going to set in? And so given the economic headwinds that Xi Jinping is facing at home, I think given the increasing coalescence of advanced industrial democracies to contest China's influence, the expansion of the BRICS, I think, is a welcome source of relief for him to say, look, we have some challenges at home and abroad, but there are other fronts in which we're doing quite well.
It reminds me, you did write a piece, I think it was in Foreign Affairs recently, about why economic independence could make the world more dangerous. And I immediately thought of these efforts to try and, at the very least, get more of your supply chain out of China because of geopolitical issues and such. Does this factor into that? I mean, obviously, in some ways, this is more economic interdependence. We're just not part of that family.
Yeah. So interdependence is, so what we've learned, and what I appreciate your flagging that piece. So the effort to reduce our dependence on China for certain vital commodities is absolutely sensible. And I think that one of the big takeaways from the early years of this decade, first with the coronavirus pandemic, then with Russia's aggression against Ukraine, is that if you're excessively interdependent with, excessively intertwined with, or dependent on strategic competitors, that interdependence, or that degree of interdependence, it introduces real vulnerabilities. COVID is a major wake-up call. My gosh, how dependent we are on China for the provision of certain medicines. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. My gosh, for Europe in particular, how dependent we are on Russia for oil and natural gas. So I think the one big takeaway has been we should not take a starry-eyed view of interdependence. Interdependence begets certain security vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Argument that I try to put forward in the foreign affairs piece you mentioned is that the flip side, in which Russia and China find more and more ways of circumventing Western economic pressure, in which they become more self-reliant, that scenario introduces security risks of its own. Because if Russia and China say, well, look, we have found ways of kind of not maybe wiping our hands of Western economic pressure, but we have found many more ways of circumventing it, and we've cultivated alternative economic relationships. If they feel that by engaging in even more brazen security provocations, that the West will have limited tools in its geoeconomic toolkit to respond, they might feel more emboldened. And so my kind of pitch in that piece is that I think a big challenge for the West will be, how do we avoid the dangers that we've seen in the early years of this decade, the dangers that arise from excessive interdependence, without succumbing to the parallel dangers that arise from
too much independence.
Exactly. So where's that kind of golden solution?
Let me end. I want to pivot to another related issue, I think, which is the U.S. is going to be hosting APEC. We're talking about odd groupings. There's an odd one, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and any country, basically, if the Pacific Ocean touches your shores, you get to be a member. It's been a powerful group for conversation, and certainly I think they've had a number of initiatives. I'm curious what the value is of these international organizations, especially when we've been talking about globalization and used to be a driver of growth. Now it seems to be a bit of a dirty word. I'm a little confused as to sort of the zeitgeist around that. We're seeing these groups come together at a time when we also see nationalism and this anti-globalization streak. What do you make of it? And I'm packing a lot of questions in there. Shame on me, bad interview style. But let's start with APEC. And the U.S. is hosting that. We've seen sort of China, Russia maybe drawing back a bit. How powerful is that organization?
So I look at it not so much in isolation, but I look at it as part of this kind of this growing constellation of organizations. I think that what we see, actually maybe sort of two examples, what we see with the expansion of the BRICS, and then to give another example, what we see with the proliferation of initiatives such as, say, AUKUS, or
what is AUKUS? Sorry.
So AUKUS is an agreement. It brings together the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, and it's an agreement that hopefully by, let's say, late 2030s, early 2040s, will provision nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. And it's an AUKUS. AUKUS is an agreement that the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia hope will enhance the deterrence posture of the West in the Indo-Pacific as China flexes its military muscle more. But what we're seeing, whether you look at middle powers in developing countries, whether you look at advanced industrial democracies, I think that they all agree that certain long-standing established international institutions have become paralyzed, have become impotent, have become inefficient. And so what we see is an experimentation with institutional architecture, participating in new organizations, more flexible formats. And so whether you look at the expansion of the BRICS, whether you look at APEC, whether you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and we could go on and on and on.
Yep.
But I see essentially kind of parallel tracks. So track one is, no country is going to say, well, we're not going to show up at, say, the UN General Assembly. No country is going to say, we're not going to participate in the deliberations of the International Monetary Fund of the World Bank. So I think track number one is, for those long-standing institutions, continue to participate, and if you can exercise some influence, great. But the parallel track, which I think is gaining momentum, is, look, keep a seat in those long-standing institutions, but recognize that they're paralyzed by growing geopolitical tensions, and so we need to experiment with smaller, issue-specific groupings of like-minded countries. And I think that second track is going to be the one that I think increasingly really defines how geopolitics proceeds.
It'll be fascinating to watch. I appreciate you helping to make us smarter about what's going on and what's around the corner. And thank you for joining us.
Diane, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.